Hello, nice to meet you. Well, today we have our tax accountant Lee Jangwon, who is excelling in the tax industry, and we will have a fun discussion about taxes once again. Last time you talked about financial transactions between family members, but this time it seems there have been some significant changes regarding inheritance tax.
That's right. What is this?
First of all, we are trying to reform the inheritance tax.
Yes.
There are really many people who pay inheritance tax. About 5% of those who pass away each year are subject to inheritance tax. I quickly mentioned the percentage, but actually, I say this before I share it during my lectures. What percentage do you think the wealthy are in the top? Most think it's 1% or 3%. These days, apartment prices have become very expensive, so there might be many. However, based on the deceased, 5% are subject to inheritance tax. It's 5.2%. But that's actually the case. Just having one apartment in Seoul or the surrounding area and passing away results in an inheritance tax of 150 million won. This is the most basic case. Recently, I spoke with someone in Bundang who has just one apartment and about 20 to 30 million won in cash.
Most of the time,
One apartment, 20 to 30 million won in cash, some savings from pensions. There are rarely any insurance policies and no stocks or cryptocurrencies. This is the case, but how much tax is there?
50 million.
It affects you? That case is very common. Then, did my father have this much wealth? Yes, indeed. By our country's standards, it seems he has become quite wealthy.
That's right.
Then they seem to be taken aback, because they think, isn't this the tax that the wealthy pay, the tax that conglomerates pay? They had that perception, but that's not the case at all.
Yes.
My recent slogan about inheritance tax has been that it has become a regular tax. Now, many people really feel this way, but I think the rise in housing prices might be the biggest reason.
That's right. It does have some influence.
So, when I was invited to the program How Did This Happen Adults on TVN, I asked about it then.
With producer a moment.
But the theme of this season was that
Knowledge of everyday life.
I said we would explore knowledge unfolded in daily life. So I asked, is this everyday knowledge? Inheritance tax isn't something we pay much. I was curious about that on the bulletin board. So many people thought this doesn't apply to me and my family. We're not that rich. There's no need to worry at all. In reality, the probability of such events happening is quite high. In the past, people said to get close if you pay inheritance tax. But these days, we talk about it because we worry about it coming up. We need to go somewhere to attend a lecture. Listen to this person. As a result, I was actually wondering how many views my YouTube channel would get. But the number of subscribers has been increasing. So, the government also realizes that the usual inheritance tax is too high. Let's make some reforms. Currently, a reform proposal has been submitted. To put it simply, the remaining deduction has increased.
Remaining deduction.
When we talk about the remaining deduction, isn't it the 50 million won over 10 years that we just discussed with the representative in the previous episode?
So,
when you think of this, there is also 50 million won for inheritance. Is there a separate deduction for inheritance as well?
yes.
When calculating to the max, first, deduct 500 million won. If you deduct 500 million won, you don't pay taxes on amounts below 500 million won.
We had done this kind of calculation.
But there is one more thing to compare with this, which is the maximum comparison. Here, there is a basic deduction of 200 million won plus 50 million won per child. And if there are disabled individuals or minors, additional deductions apply. If having children, you need 7 children to get 50 million won each, totaling 350 million won. Adding 200 million won is 550 million won. Of around 100 inheritance tax cases I handle, there is usually just one person like this. It's almost around 5,000 won. Having up to 7 children is actually quite a lot, so it was a system that was almost useless. However, they are proposing to raise that 50 million won per person to 500 million won.
500 million won. Suddenly 10 times? Surprising, right?
People who know the system are surprised. Do you know a lot, CEO? No, this doesn't make sense. Taxes are usually changed gradually. At most, it's about doubling. But there's almost nothing that increases by more than 10 times. Wow. This is a really great tip. So, according to inheritance tax statistics, over 80% of those who are passing away now are in their 60s, about 70% are in their 70s, and 55% are over 80. So, I looked at the average total fertility rate when these people were young.
I see. The table becomes easy to understand.
Our data is Richgo, right?
Data is necessary. You are truly amazing.
Looking at the data, it's 3.27 people. So there are about 3. But I think about those who have passed away in their 70s or older, and I offer free consultations for those who have passed away regarding inheritance tax, because I just see it as an obituary. I take the time to offer free consultations and tell them how much the inheritance tax is, but most of the time, there are really 3 children. Today, someone I consulted had 4, so there are 2 cases with 4 people. So how much would that be?
It's 2 billion for PPL.
It becomes 2.2 billion now. It was previously 500 million. The deduction amount is significantly increasing.
That's right.
If it's 2.2 billion, in most areas it shouldn't be taxed, right?
I will make it.
I submitted such a reform plan, but I don't know if it will pass. It hasn't passed yet. It hasn't been approved by the company. People listen until the end.
That's right.
However, if the deduction amount changes, what happens is that we looked at the number of people who reported based on the number of decedents last year. The taxable standard for those reporting inheritance tax under 100 million won is 18 to 200 people, with 200 people under 100 million won, about 18%. Under 300 million won is about 41%. Under 500 million won is 55%. And under 1 billion won is 75%. If the deduction amount exceeds 1 billion won, the number of people who can report it drastically decreases.
That's right.
So if the deduction amount increases, you probably won't have to worry about inheritance tax anymore. But now, instead of changing to a remaining deduction, what do you think it will change to? In fact, what the ruling and opposition parties are discussing now is to raise the lump sum deduction from 500 million won to 800 million won. And if there is a spouse, the spouse's deduction ranges from a minimum of 500 million won to a maximum of 3 billion won.
Yes, just having a spouse.
Because you have engaged in economic activities with your spouse, so please separate the spouse a bit.
That is the purpose.
The minimum deduction for a spouse was 500 million won, but this could also be raised to 800 million or 1 billion won. The deduction may rise by 300 million to 500 million won. So, there is a high probability that this will be a kind of compromise, right? From what I see, it seems so. Then, about 50% of those currently worried about inheritance tax don't need to worry.
Ah, I see.
If this passes, I think there will be many people who will be happy. First of all, the burden will be less, because they probably have never thought about paying inheritance tax.
That's right.
However, as apartment prices have risen, many people are affected, and now the government is saying they will provide this.
That's right.
They are saying they will alleviate this a bit, since apartment prices have risen too much. However, there seems to be additional content to this. I see. What is this? Inheritance acquisition tax. This is something that is being discussed belatedly. And then, the government proposed to try this as well. Today, I met people who were fighting because of it. The reason for the conflict is that South Korea's inheritance tax creates a structure that inevitably leads to disputes.
Oh, really?
The reason is that the inheritance tax must be paid on the total amount owned by the deceased.
That's right.
So, if I have 3 billion won, for example, let's assume the tax calculated here comes out to 500 million won.
It came 501.
But the amount I received is 500 million won, and the second one received 2.5 billion won.
Yes.
Let's make a hypothetical situation. The friend who took 2.5 billion is trying to pay inheritance tax, but I've spent all my money.
It's just like being broke.
This could happen, right?
Is that even possible?
The case I encountered today is that case. I meet all sorts of cases, but the problem is that inheritance tax is joint liability. This means it's simple. I have to pay inheritance tax based on the amount of property I received.
500 million?
The inheritance tax is 500 million. If this friend refuses to pay, both of us could end up with a property seizure, and I might have to pay the entire 500 million from my property. Wow. I only inherited 500 million, but even with just that, the tax can be maximized based on the property one received. Essentially, if you get 3 billion and have to pay 500 million in taxes, you could get 2.9 billion and only 100 million. Then I would only be taxed on the 100 million I received. But, regardless, everything I received could potentially just disappear as tax. It means I also have responsibility. That's why inheritance disputes are fought from the very beginning.
Is it okay to do this?
Just pay taxes based on the proportion received. That proportion doesn't work. Right now, it doesn't work in our country.
Why?
It only states to pay based on what was received. You can split the payment based on that proportion, but in fact, only one payment notice is issued.
Note 500 million.
You all take care of it? No. If this is done institutionally, it seems like there would be no disputes.
It would be a bit less.
So, when inheritance tax disputes arise, the tax takes a back seat and they fight over this. Then they miss the inheritance tax filing deadline and additional taxes accumulate, but if it's 1 day late, the additional tax is 20%.
It's 20%, right? Even if it's just once late.
So they don't even know how much inheritance tax they will pay. Then it turns out to be 1 billion won. If a day passes, the additional tax is 200 million won. And now the payment becomes overdue. It accumulates at 8% annually. Then, when the inheritance tax investigation comes, by that time, the discussions about the inherited assets are somewhat completed. Like, you bring this, you bring that. But then, the invitation for the inheritance tax audit arrives.
Pay up. So what now?
Wait a minute. The lawyer hasn't said anything about this. But the lawyer doesn't handle taxes, right?
That's right.
Taxes are handled by the tax accountant, so if such related issues arise, you must meet with a lawyer, but you also definitely need to meet with a tax accountant. So most people meet with a tax accountant first, because before the work happens, they ask to sort out the division of assets or taxes. That's the kind of issue I deal with all the time. They fight in front.
Please don't fight. Please listen to what I have to say.
I mentioned that these tax risks must be shared. So, for example, if you inherit 500 million won in cash assets, I advise you to not spend a single one and keep it tied up.
Acquisition tax.
Because you also have to pay inheritance acquisition tax on real estate. It's also in units of 100 million won.
카드미터로 flowing.
If you inherit real estate, you have to pay acquisition tax on it as well.
That's right.
That's in units of 100 million. The inheritance tax case I'm currently dealing with also has an acquisition tax of 12 million. After paying that, you also have to pay inheritance tax. But when it comes to paying those funds, you fight. So first, keep this cash-like asset tied up. Most of the time, if you inherit real estate, you can't sell it.
In a short time. That's right.
Such occurrences are common. So let's change the inheritance acquisition tax. What this means is that we are trying to resolve this issue.
Pay according to what you got.
So, each person is responsible for reporting and paying inheritance tax according to the proportion they inherited. And there will be no joint liability, right? I think it's definitely right to change this, because South Korea's inheritance tax was initially designed that way. It's difficult to capture the assets. So, let's tax the total amount that this person has. But now, we have become an incredibly data-driven society.
That's right.
Because there is an enormous amount of active data, we can capture those aspects and do it. Pay according to what you received individually. Documentaries are becoming a bit less common. What I want to suggest is that the deductions in inheritance tax have slightly increased. I want to say just two things to those who have had their deductions increased. The deductions have been raised due to the reforms coming next year. So please think of it as an opportunity. Why? Because the water was once filled to the brim, and now our property deductions have increased to 200 million. If we assume my property is only 1 billion, then if I just stay still, I won't pay inheritance tax or anything. Don't think like that. You should think about raising this 1 billion to 1.5 billion.
Why?
After all, taxes are forever inheritance taxes. But why is that? My father may have passed away, but the amount I receive is just the start. If I receive 1 billion and sell it for 2 billion in the future, I will have to pay taxes on that 1 billion.
Capital gains tax.
But if you raise it to 1.5 billion and only pay capital gains tax on the 500 million, the tax difference is several hundred million. You need to get an appraisal during the inheritance tax reporting period. So please, don't just sit idly by.
I watch too much.
Especially when you receive a rural property like a chicken farm, the registration costs are not even worth it, but it's still inheritance tax.
Why report it?
Those who have learned about assets, like wealthy individuals, report even if their assets are worth zero. They need to raise the value.
That's right. The price needs to be raised.
Rather, the first thing is how to effectively utilize the remaining water. Secondly, there is 2 billion won on the day of passing, but we don't know how much was gifted over the 10 years before.
That's right.
Because they thoroughly investigate the records of gifts given to heirs over 10 years and to non-heirs over 5 years, there was a case where, on the day of passing, there was 4 billion won. During the meeting, we said there was 4 billion, but the total given over 10 years was 14 billion.
That's right.
Are you kidding me?
How did you know?
No, the account statements all come out. The tax office conducts thorough tax audits on all of this. They wait for 10 years and examine everything in detail. So you can't just cover your eyes and pretend. I hope you please remember these two very important things. The Daepyeonde is also important indeed. Well, this is indeed good news. And if the deduction amounts increase, many people will benefit, which is great. However, don't let your guard down.
That's right. That's correct.
Be sure to contact our tax consultant, Mr. Jangwon, for a consultation, and he's also active on YouTube. I keep posting things like this constantly.
Exactly.
On YouTube, our tax consultant, Jangwon, the Toad.
Toad tax consultant? Why Toad?
My first child's pen name is Toad.
Taman was Toad.
Ah, That's why it's Toad Tax Consultant. If you search for Toad Tax Consultant on YouTube, you can find many great videos from our Jangwon tax consultant. So please visit often, and it would be great if you could like and subscribe as well. Thank you to our Jangwon tax consultant for sharing such valuable insights today.
Yes, thank you.